Cantilever brakes aren't dead yet. Most pro cyclocross riders use them, particularly the Europeans, and the chances are that if your cyclocross bike is more than a couple of years old, you've got them too. Now, the difference between a poorly set up cantilever brake and a well set up one is massive, probably a greater difference in fact than any other type of braking system. But tuning cantilever brakes is a dying art. So here are our tips on how to get the most out of your brakes. Now, we'll be looking at increasing power and modulation through making sure you get the most mechanical advantage from the system. We'll also then look at decreasing friction, checking the brake pads, and then finally dealing with the dreaded brake judder. By far and away, the biggest effect on power is the mechanical advantage of your system. And that's basically a posh way of saying the leverage. Now, a lot of it's built into things like your brake levers and then also your choice of cantilevers themselves, but we'll condense it into one really important adjustment. Essentially, you need to have the straddle cable here as low as you can. Now, the trade-off is that you'll reduce mud clearance slightly, both here at the forks and also at the pads themselves, but it might be a trade-off that's worth making. I certainly feel that it is. Most cantilever brakes have got a slightly different way of doing it, but essentially there'll always be some kind of bolt on the yoke itself, that's that thing there, and then you loosen it and you lower it down. And then you'll need to take the slack in on this straddle cable as well. As a good but very rough gauge of how efficient your system is, the brakes should feel quite squishy at the lever and not wooden. Wooden means less powerful, squishy means more powerful. Because canti brakes are inherently less powerful than virtually any other type of braking system, it's really important that you work to preserve every ounce of force that your fingers pull on the brake levers with. Now, in the first instance, you need the smoothest possible cables with the least amount of friction. If they're at all sticky or gritty, then you need to replace them. Keeping the housing length to a minimum will help, and certainly if you've got the money, compressionless housing will too, but it is blooming expensive. Next, with the brakes unhooked from the cables, move them on the bosses to check whether there's any friction there. Now, you can feel it if there is. It's likely that the return spring wouldn't be strong enough. Now, if there is any friction at all, the chances are it could be coming from the boss itself. So we'll just take the cantilever off, see what that's like. The metal here should be super smooth and free from any dirt or corrosion. Give it a good clean, and if needed, rub it down really lightly with some emery paper just to get it back to super smooth. Now, once you've done that, lightly grease it and then pop the canti back on. Some canti brakes have their own bearings on, in which case you need to look at those rather than the boss itself. But if that's the case, just grease them there instead. When you're putting the brake back on, put the spring in that middle hole there, which is supposedly the best balance for spring tension. Now, I personally, however, use the lower hole, which eases the spring tension and makes the brake feel lighter. Now, you do have to keep on top of your cables, because if you've got sticky, gritty cables, then the spring is too weak to overcome that. But that's a price I'm willing to pay for a light lever feel. Let's turn our attention to brake pads next. And they need to be slightly toed in, which is where the leading edge of the pad strikes the rim slightly before the trailing edge. Now, it only needs to be by a millimetre or so, so when you're setting it up, insert a piece of card between the pad and the rim at the trailing edge, which will get it just right. Now, cyclocross brakes have a habit of squealing really badly, and towing the pads in is the best way to combat that. The pad itself plays a pretty big role, as you might imagine, in the quality of your braking. Firstly, make sure it's not super worn and full of grit and crap that's going to be mashing your rims up. But also, if you've got the choice, have a look at the compound of the pad itself. Now, you can spend a whole lot of money on new pads that will actually improve the performance. Personally though, I can't actually justify spending 5 times more than a stock pair of pads, but they are there if you've got the cash. Brake judder can absolutely plague cyclocross bikes. Now, if you don't immediately know what I mean by brake judder, then the chances are that you probably don't suffer from it. But if you do, then you'll be familiar with that horrible, massive vibration that comes from your front forks when you apply the front brake hard. Now, there's no easy fix for it, but the first no-no is having your brake hanger mounted up here under the stem. If you can, move it down to your front forks, which makes it much, much better. The other thing is increasing the toe in on your brakes. If you do it significantly, then that also can have a slight effect. Ultimately though, it seems that the stiffness of the fork is the primary cause. Now I've recently ridden a cross bike with disc brakes that suffer from brake judder as well, so really we can isolate the cantilever brakes from that completely. And if that's the case, I'm afraid it's just a case of buying a stiffer front fork. We've been enjoying riding cantilever brakes for years, and so just because discs are now coming along, it doesn't mean that these are something to consign to your spare parts bin. Just pay particular attention to the mechanical advantage, so the setup, reducing friction, and then also the pads. You'll be able to stop on a dime whenever you need to, and like I said, they still look pretty pro. We've got a huge archive of mechanical how-to videos, and so to watch them, click over there on the playlist. And to never miss a future mechanical video, subscribe to GCN.